Hoyoverse, why do you gotta go and make things so complicated? What's up, Trailblazers? This is Caleb with another guide, except this video is more of a character analysis than a build guide. Kafka is one of the more complicated characters in this game. Her kit has a lot of different elements, and I think she's often misunderstood. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down her kit, and I'll try to demystify the character for you. Before we jump into my analysis, let's look at what she does first. What are Kafka's abilities, and what's her skill set? She has a basic attack just like anyone else. Things start to get interesting with her skill. Her skill does clear damage, so one primary target and adjacent enemies. After that, the skill then does additional damage to the primary target based on the total dot damage on the target. The more damage that is stacked, the more damage Kafka's skill would do. And what's great about the skill is that it does not consume dot stacks. Kafka's talent is when an ally uses a basic attack, Kafka launches a follow-up attack, and that follow-up attack can apply a shock to the enemy. Kafka's talent allows her to boost up the damage of her skill and ultimate later on in the fight. Her ultimate is a team-wide AoE. It does AoE damage, then applies shock, and then lastly, it does additional damage to each enemy based on the dots on those enemies. So basically, you can think of her ultimate as an AoE form of her skill. The more dots on the enemies there are, the more damage Kafka's ultimate will do. Now that we've learned about Kafka's abilities and skill set, we're faced with a big question. Does Kafka enable dot teams? Does Kafka change the meta? And the answer is sort of, not really. What Kafka does is that Kafka enables Kafka teams. Kafka is the main carry that synergizes well with the dots that are applied by her supports. But I don't think the meta is going to change very much, unless Hoyoverse releases a lot of enemies that are especially vulnerable to dots. So what does Kafka bring to the table? Kafka is essentially a carry that takes advantage of the dots that are applied by her supports. You will not find a good team with just Kafka. However, dot characters can be viable without Kafka. There are two characters in the game right now that represent the dot faction. We have Sampo and Serval. When I was preparing for this video, I opened up a spreadsheet and did a bunch of damage calculations to see how strong Sampo and Serval are. And it turns out they're actually pretty good within their niche. For example, Sampo does respectable single target damage because his wind share can stack. When you have 5 stacks of wind share, you have a 200% damage multiplier on his dot, which is quite a lot, and this is not counting the initial damage that Sampo does with his skill. And as for Serval, Serval is pretty competitive in AoE situations. She can apply shock to the entire enemy team very easily, and her shock has a very high base damage of 80%. This is in comparison to Sampo's 40% and Hook's 50%. So in conclusion, dot characters in the game don't need Kafka to be good. It's actually the other way around. Kafka needs dot characters to be good. So what kind of teams can you make with Kafka? Kafka definitely has hypercarry potential with dot supports. Her damage increases and scales up the more dots there are on enemies. So if her supports can apply a lot of dots, Kafka's damage will go really high. The flip side of this is that if her supports have trouble applying dots, then Kafka's damage will go down. And consequently, Kafka's damage profile changes a lot with the support. If you pair Kafka with Serval, Kafka will be much better at doing AoE damage. If you pair Kafka with Sampo, Kafka will be better at doing single target damage. Her damage basically follows where the dots are. Lastly, when you're making a team with Kafka, you have to take into consideration skill points. With Kafka, you want to be using your skill a lot. And there are some dot supports that also want to use their skill a lot. For example, Sampo. You want to make sure that your final team has enough skill point generators to support both Kafka and her supports. So what does a Kafka team look like? The first thing you need is a support that can apply dots. At the moment in the game, we only have Serval and Sampo. When Kafka comes out, you also have the option of Luca. You want at least one sustain support, so a Japard, a Bailu, or a Luocha. The last slot is a flex slot. You can add a second dot support to make Kafka a bigger carry. If you're facing a tough enemy team, you might want to add another sustain support. Ultimately, it depends on what enemies you're facing. At this point, you're probably curious about what are the best relics like cones and traces for Kafka. My response is just wait. At the moment, there are too many unknowns to make good recommendations. I hope you understand Kafka better after watching this video. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.